How a 1911 pistol from the trenches still serves in the 21st century. Say it out loud, and you can feel the unlikely promise in the sentence. A sidearm born under gas clouds and signal flares, designed when cavalry horses still nudged railroad embankments, somehow walks into airport hangars and modern armories without apologizing for its age. This is the story of why it happened, and the best way to begin is with a simple picture. A slab-sided automatic laid on a wooden bench, oiled cloth beside it, slides slightly open so a crescent of brass shows at the chamber mouth. A design that seems both minimal and purposeful, as if it knows what it's for and doesn't care to explain. The name attached to it is now a shorthand for American industrial genius, John Moses Browning, but the name alone doesn't carry the weight of what he created in the 1911. He blended a short recoil tilting barrel mechanism with a straight-to-the-point single-action trigger that breaks with intention. He wrapped it around a fat cartridge, 45 ACP, that soldiers would describe in the field with the unscientific but unforgettable phrase, "It stops things." He gave it controls sized for gloved hands, a manual safety that made sense under pressure, and a grip angle that let the sights lift back onto target almost by instinct. Adopted formally in 1911 after a bruising series of trials, the pistol didn't sweep in with fanfare so much as it trudged onto the stage with a workman's lunch pail, ready to do a job that sometimes required ugly simplicity. The timing was ruthless. Within a few years, the world tipped into a conflict that turned neat parade ground doctrine into mud. The United States would step into that storm and discover what every army had learned since the matchlock. When distances collapse and plans go sideways, a sidearm becomes a personal lifeline. In that crucible, the new pistol did not merely appear on tables and requisition lists. It earned something harder to win: trust. The cycle of operation was easy to explain, easier still to demonstrate. Pull the slide back and let it surge forward, and you could feel the spring's confidence. Lock the slide, look through the ejection port, and you saw the logic of Browning's feed system. Press the trigger, and the brake was not mysterious. It was mechanical honesty. Every one of those tiny, tactile truths mattered to a human being who might in the next moment need the machine to work. A technical manual will tell you the barrel is just over 5 inches, the magazine holds 7, sometimes 8, the overall weight is something you feel on a hip all day but don't curse, and the frame is steel that shrugs off hard use if you treat it with ordinary care. Yet the reason this pistol took root has less to do with a spreadsheet of dimensions and more to do with its frictionless relationship to stress. Under adrenaline, controls either get in the way or get out of it. Here, they get out of it. The safety snicks off with a motion that feels grown rather than learned. The slide stop sits where a thumb expects it. The magazine release, neither hair-trigger light nor stubborn, behaves like a part designed by someone who spent time with people who actually used guns. It is fashionable to turn such observations into mythology, but myth isn't required here. The instrument is persuasive on its own. The cartridge is part of this persuasion. Paper targets do not negotiate, steel plates neither panic nor persevere. Humans are complicated. The 45 ACP was selected because early 20th century decision-makers wanted a round that did not depend upon marginal effects. There were other ways to solve that equation: more capacity with smaller bullets, more velocity from different platforms, but at the point of adoption, the 45 rode a narrative built from colonial fights and close-in skirmishes. Stories from those fights, the sort that spread through mess halls faster than official reports, said a heavy, slow-moving bullet pushed its argument with authority. Once those stories met a service pistol that ran reliably, confidence became self-reinforcing. It's a mistake to reduce the pistol's early reputation to caliber alone, but it is just as wrong to ignore how ballistics and ergonomics in this instance managed to sing harmony. Craft matters. The first examples were built in a manufacturing culture that took pride in interchangeable parts without surrendering the fit and finish sensibility inherited from hand shops. Slides met frames with just enough play to run in the dirt and just enough snugness to keep the sights honest beyond the distance of a handshake. The finish wore along sharp edges in a way collectors still find beautiful, but that beauty was a side effect of something more enduring, a union of geometry and metallurgy that did not put fragile tolerances between a soldier and a loud, reliable answer. Armories issued them, units trained with them, people carried them. And then, without fanfare, those people carried them into the kind of history that doesn't speak softly. It is tempting to state the conclusion too early, to point at the dates and service anecdotes and declare the matter settled with a flourish. But the continuity of this pistol's life isn't about nostalgia padded with sepia tones. A design can grow old in two ways. It can calcify, becoming an exhibit that inspires lectures and little else. Or it can age like a tool that found a sweet spot where human hands and mechanical parts cooperate. The 1911 is the second thing. It looks the way it does because it wants to be held a certain way, and it works the way it does because, under stress, that way is natural. In the decades that followed its adoption, other materials would challenge steel, other calibers would compete with 45 ACP, other frame shapes would offer different compromises. Yet this machine's core remained stubbornly relevant, a trigger that breaks like a thought, a barrel and slide that move like a sentence with one verb, and a silhouette that draws like a well-practiced signature. Stand beside an armourer's bench, and you will hear that relevance explained with plain words. The parts are understandable. The springs tell the truth about when they're tired. The pistol rewards good magazines and punishes bad ones. A fairness that is almost moral. It is not a toy. It is not magic. It is a system that makes sense. That sense carried it from adoption to mobilization and into rain, cordite haze and barbed wire. From there it kept walking. What remains is a promise to the viewer. This story will not be a museum tour cul-de-sac. It is a journey from an engineering decision in the early 20th century to a presence that still makes practical sense in the early 21st. Along the way, there will be mud, yes, and there will be diagrams. There will be procurement drama and the quiet stubbornness of users. There will be myths repeated so often they sound like facts, and there will be facts so disarmingly simple that people ignore them because they do not flatter preconceptions. Beginning here, the point is simple. A pistol born in 1911 has nothing left to prove to time. It proved itself to people. And people, soldiers, armourers, competitors, collectors, and the odd special operator who keeps old things for new reasons, keep proving it right. The first true test did not arrive with a trumpeter's call, but with the soft, miserable sound of water soaking through wool. The place is a trench. The month is a disagreement between calendars and insomnia, and a young man is learning how close the earth can feel when fear and duty are trying to push each other out of the way. Mud swallows boots, and light dies early. The machine gun to the left is a heartbeat and a prayer, and the pistol at the hip is not a theory. It is insurance against the part of war that refuses to behave. In that place, the new automatic did not ask to be believed. It simply worked. Men learned to thumb off the safety even with numb fingers. They learned the angle of the sights in the dim world between dawn and full grey. They learned that a weapon you barely think about becomes an extension of your will. Reliability is not a slogan underground. It becomes the unglamorous sum of dozens of small mercies. Feed lips that don't bend in a pocket, extractors that bite brass without drama, a recoil spring that does not turn timid in cold, wet air. When a weapon keeps those promises, stories grow around it. One man says his pistol blew sludge out of its own throat and asked for more. Another tells of slipping in a communication trench and catching the slide against a duckboard, only to find it still chambered and ready. A veteran with the long stare of someone who has heard too many shells will show you a pistol with the finish peeled away like fish scales and tell you that steel matters more than shine because shine goes away while steel keeps a secret. If it is made right and kept in decent shape, it will not quit. The field stripped the romance away and left function. Mud got everywhere. It turned magazine wells into flower pots and grips into clay. Still, the pistol's guts were simple and strong. Knock out a pin, pull apart, wipe a surface, push it back together. The rhythm took 15 minutes when the weather cooperated, and a little longer when it didn't, but the point was that no mystery lived inside the frame. The firing pin did not ask to be understood in the language of specialists. The link under the barrel swung with the patience of a hinge built by someone who knew hinges. Even a man new to machines could watch this one breathe open and closed and grasp what mattered: friction, alignment, spring tension, clean magazines, decent ammunition, attention to what you feel when you run the slide. There were doubters. Any self-loading pistol, they said, would be a delicate thing in a place where grit outnumbered clean tools 1,000 to 1. And it is true that machines fail. Everything fails someplace. But this pistol failed less often than many of its contemporaries, and it did so with a personality users could read. When a magazine was bad, it behaved in a consistent way. When fouling built up, it gave warning signs in the feel of the slide and the sound of the return. In the economy of trust, predictability is as much a currency as perfection. The shovel knows the kind of earth it will meet. The boot knows how long it can be wet before blisters turn from annoyance to danger. In the same ledger, a pistol that tells you what it is doing earns the benefit of the doubt. Close-in fights turned theory into a different sort of math. Bayonets were symbols and sometimes instruments. Rifles were excellent until a corner or crater reshaped the room. At arm's length, the heavy bullet did not need to explain itself. The pistol's balance made it both controllable for aimed shots and manageable for the kind of fast work that erupts when men tumble into each other. Stories about absolute qualities tend to harden into claims that can't be supported, but one quality requires no exaggeration. A sidearm that runs when hands are shaking is an honest friend. That honesty created the kind of loyalty that cannot be designed into a brochure. There is a moment in every field report where the human voice cracks through the technical description. A private will mention the weight on a long march, and then, almost to his own surprise, add that the weight becomes comforting because it means a certain option exists if the world gets too small. An officer will note the pistol's habit of chewing through ammunition types with minimal complaint, and then confess he stopped thinking about it except when he needed to clean it. A machine gun crewman whose first love is the belt-fed symphony will talk about carrying the sidearm like a talisman when moving the big gun, because carrying ammunition and spare barrels turns men into targets, and a target wants something close and personal when the tune changes. And then there are the small shifts nobody planned. A soldier learns to cup a hand over the rear of the slide when moving in tight spaces so the gun doesn't drag loudly against wood. Another learns that a rag pulled through the magazine well after patrol keeps the grit from crunching. The platoon joker figures out that if you tilt the pistol under starlight just so, the tiny front sight catches enough glow to count as a guide. None of this belongs in a manual, yet all of it belongs in the weapon's biography, because a weapon is what users make of it. The conditions in those first years were a harsh editor. Poor designs, or good designs poorly made, left service quickly or became dreaded burdens. This one kept finding its way back into holsters with a certain stubbornness that looked like confidence. What begins in mud rarely ends in it. Those earliest lessons gave the pistol something that cannot be copied with cosmetic changes, a reputation born on bad days. When a thing is tested where nobody sees and still does its work, word spreads in lines of quiet respect. In the decades that would follow, the pistol would be polished, altered, debated, praised and replaced, sometimes in the same paragraph. Yet whenever people argue about why it lasted, they end up returning to the trench. They remember that a good tool looks almost unimpressive in a museum case because the real beauty was in the way it shrugged at weather and worry and did what it was asked. That is where the legend began, and legends that grow from competence do not fade when the camera crews go home. They stick to the hands of the living. Time has a way of sanding sharp edges, but in the interwar years the sanding came from intent rather than neglect. The pistol that stepped out of the mud did not need a revolution. It needed small courtesies to the human beings who would spend long days with it. Those courtesies arrived in the form of changes now grouped under a suffix that sounds formal, but really just means we listened. The 1911 A1 is less a sequel than an edit. You can see it when you lay an early specimen beside a later one and let your eyes do the work. The trigger is shorter, an acknowledgement that not every hand wears the same glove. There are little scallops, relief cuts behind the trigger guard that let a finger find its path without fighting the frame. The mainspring housing swells into an arch on many examples, nudging the muzzle's point of rest so that sights align with less conscious effort for a wider set of shooters. The grip safety's spur grows a little, its job more clearly defined. Keep the web of the hand safe when the hammer flies, especially for those whose grip rides high and aggressive. Sights, those small iron whispers, become a touch more visible. None of these things turn heads across a parade field, but every one of them speaks softly to the person whose thumb rubs bluing off a safety by the end of a training cycle. These changes emerged from feedback in classrooms and on ranges, the places where armies decide whether a tool is a welcome companion or an assigned burden. Instructors traded notes, armourers logged patterns, shooters complained or praised in the rackroom voice that carries through cinderblock halls. When patterns repeat, smart organisations adjust the hardware to the human rather than insist the human adjust to the hardware beyond what is reasonable. The brilliance of the update is its restraint. Nothing core was sacrificed. The basic operating system remained the same, which meant the reliability observed in the worst conditions did not vanish in the name of fashion. Instead, ergonomics stepped forward to borrow authority from mechanics, and together they produced something subtly better. You can sense the thinking behind the arched mainspring housing when you point the pistol at a blank wall and let it mount like a reflex. Where the earliest frame might dip or rise depending on the shooter's hand, the revised contour quietly encourages a natural index. It doesn't force the issue, it offers a hint. The shorter trigger accomplishes a similar kindness in a different direction. It makes the reach slightly more democratic, which in turn makes the trigger break feel more like a decision and less like a stretch. The relief cuts take a modest bite out of metal and give the finger room to live. And if that sounds minor, you have not spent full days teaching recruits whose hands come in as many shapes as the stories that brought them to the range. The grip safety spur tells a different story, one about lessons learned when hammers met flesh on enthusiastic grips. Anyone who has trained hard on early examples knows the sting of the web after long sessions. The longer spur moves the margin of error away from pain, encouraging the high, locked-in grip that modern technique would later formalize. Even before technique had a name, the hardware nudged shooters toward it by refusing to punish eagerness. Sights are the bridge between intention and reality. On the original, they were tiny and almost austere, born of a world that prized ruggedness and expected most fights to be decided at short distances. In the update, they grew in a way that stops well short of target pistol ostentation, but grants the eye a more honest chance. A little more height, a little more width, and suddenly the front post is something you can truly hold on a chest in poor light. You still have to do your part, but the tool stops pretending that every battlefield is a sunny day. If the interwar years were simply a period of minor edits, the story would be tidy enough. But history is never content with tidy. Economic tides shifted. Industrial capacity had to be brokered between peacetime thrift and wartime preparation, and other sidearms kept evolving in parallel. Some nations embraced double-action triggers. Some flirted with different calibers and shapes. Against that changing backdrop, the updated pistol was not frozen in place. It was tested again and again in small laboratories of use. Police departments adopted it here and there, sometimes modifying details to suit training philosophies. Civilians bought commercial variants and discovered that an accurate, consistent single-action trigger turns drills into precise rituals rather than frustrating chores. Gunsmiths began to see possibilities in the platform, A different sight picture here, a crisper break there, a spring weight tuned to particular loads. Where some designs become hostile to modification, this frame and slide seem to accept careful attention with grace. What truly matters in this era is that human factors came to the front. The myth that soldiers are interchangeable shadows crumbled under the pressure of building a force that had to fight in real places with real hands. Not every shooter stands the same height, sees the same contrast, or fights the same tremors when the adrenaline starts to speak. The revised pistol did not claim to solve all of this, but it met soldiers halfway. The result was a baseline sidearm that, out of the crate, worked for more people, more of the time, with less cursing and fewer compensations. That is the sort of institutional quiet victory that never makes recruitment posters, but shows up as fewer training injuries, better qualification scores, and more instructors spending time on tactics rather than on apologizing for a tool's quirks. The interwar years also set the stage for the hard use to come. Steel quality, heat treat practices, and machining consistency improved under the same industrial discipline that would later churn out war material at astonishing speed. Interchangeability ceased to be an aspiration and became an expectation. That meant field units could mix and match parts in a pinch without turning a reliable pistol into a paperweight. It also meant that the platform assumed the role of a true system rather than a precious object. A system can be sustained. A precious object must be preserved.
None of this is romantic. It is practical, and practicality is often the most respectful way to honor people who will trust a tool with their lives. By the time the world stumbled again toward catastrophe, the pistol that marched out of armories wore small, humane changes that did not announce themselves with brass bands, but made long days less punishing and short, decisive moments more controllable. That combination, mechanical continuity and ergonomic empathy, would prove as valuable as armor and fuel when production lines lit up and ships carried crates that clinked with the weight of steel and expectation.
When war stopped being a rumor and became a schedule, the pistol revealed another virtue that cannot be tested on a single range day: producibility at scale without losing its soul. Names not usually associated with handguns appeared on slides: Remington Rand, Union Switch, and Signal Ithaca, because the nation treated the design as a standard, not a brand. Factories that had once made typewriters, railroad components, and precision instruments learned to cut sears and rails and feed ramps to a tolerance that was both realistic for mass production and respectful of function. The result was not a boutique item dribbling off a custom bench. It was a million-strong cohort of sidearms that looked like they belonged together, sounded alike when the slide ran home, and behaved with the same sober willingness across fields and oceans. In Europe, the pistol rode in holsters from hedgerows to winter forests. Infantry officers, tank crews, engineers, medics, and machine gun teams all had reasons to carry it. The reasons changed by job, and the jobs changed by week, but a common thread ran through the testimonies. The pistol was there when rifles were stacked or slung, when a vehicle crew bailed out and the world became too tight for long guns, when a doorway turned into a decision. It could be drawn with one hand while the other steadied a ladder or pulled a comrade, and it could be made safe with a motion that took less than a thought. European mud was not the same as the earlier, infamous mud, and yet grit still existed, cold still numbed fingers, and fear still shook hands. In those conditions, the pistol's predictability steadied people who had very little else to steady them. Across the Pacific, the environment rewrote rules with heat, salt, and rot. Weapons rusted if they were offended by weather. Leather learned to smell like ships and mildew. Jungle fights treated distance as an opinion, not a fact, and ambushes turned time into a snap. The pistol in that theatre did not become a primary weapon. That was never its role. But it became an intimate one. The fat bullet that some claimed moved too slowly moved with a purpose that did not care about charts when the distance between lives was measured in paces. The simple sights, slightly improved but still rugged, did not demand coddling. A man who cleaned his weapon in a few consistent minutes every day found it ready when mornings came too early and nights refused to end. Production stories can seem dry until you realize they explain why so many individual experiences align. Singer, of sewing machine fame, made a small number of highly prized pistols before its capacity was redirected. Ithaca's output wore its own character while staying true to the pattern. Remington Rand, the typewriter maker, turned out huge numbers that today still show up wearing the patina of service rather than the pristine vanity of a collector queen. Armourers shipped parts to units that could swap broken guns back into serviceable condition without waiting for a perfect match from a distant depot. This is what standardization looks like when it is not a committee word but a field advantage. When your country can ramp production across multiple factories and still deliver a weapon that users recognize instantly, you have created more than a tool. You have created a language. There were debates, of course. Some argued for different calibers, pointing to capacity as a decisive factor. Others wanted new action types, curious whether a double-action first shot would make troops safer or faster. Those arguments were worthwhile and would later shape procurement decisions. But in the middle of a global fire, the existing sidearm kept showing up as an unexciting but beloved constant. An officer would be issued a pistol and treat it like a watch, rarely the star of the day, always implicitly trusted to function when consulted. A pilot might carry one as a last resort compact assurance, tame under a flight suit and promising noise if silence was no longer an option. A paratrooper would secure it high and tight before a jump and feel its weight like a sentence that ends with a period rather than a question mark. Accuracy under stress matters. The single-action trigger that some critics dismiss as old proved once again that a crisp break aids hits. Men who had been taught to press, not yank, the trigger found that the pistol rewarded their discipline. At service distances, the groups were honest, which is to say, centered when the front sight was managed and forgivably wide when it wasn't. The gun did not pretend to make a beginner an expert. No tool does that. But it refrained from sabotaging competent hands. That restraint sounds like a low bar until you spend time with instruments that make even good shooters fight hardware instead of problems. As the war wore on, the sidearm gathered trivia that aren't trivial. Unit engravings, worn corners, holsters softened to the shape of an individual frame, all of it combined to form 1,000 private biographies. A shipboard security detailer trusts the weapon on narrow gangways where a long gun is a liability. A shore patrolman uses the authoritative silhouette less as a threat than as a statement that order has a spine. A medic, not intended to fight, still carries one because reality laughs at intent. The same object travelled these roles without embarrassment because the design did not lean on gimmicks. It was simple, strong, and forgiving. From Europe to the Pacific, the pistol also taught industrial lessons. You can't build 1 million copies of anything without learning what tolerances break when rushed and which ones matter most. Edges changed subtly in response. Heat treat protocols stabilized. Inspectors learned to look for the kind of wear that forecasts failure rather than inconveniences. Magazines, always the beating heart of a repeating pistol, improved as makers refined feed lip geometry for military ammunition. These are not poster stories. They are shop floor victories that save lives months later on islands or in ruined cities. The platform's ability to accept such continuous improvement without becoming finicky is a mark of robust design. Machines that only work when new and coddled do not deserve uniforms. When the war officially ended in bursts of joy and long silences, the sidearm did not retire to ceremonial duty. It followed people home, appeared in depots, moved to new bases, and prepared for the next contradiction history would serve. This continuity would invite a later debate about modernization and standardization with allies, and eventually some services would choose a different road. But before that turning, the pistol had already carved a reputation spanning continents and climates. It was not the only good design of its era, nor was it perfect. It was simply the one that kept its promises across oceans, factories, and faces. That is why so many hands remember the feel of its safety, the exact travel of its slide, and the way its front sight answers the eye. A workhorse with a memory becomes more than equipment. It becomes part of how a generation learned to finish hard days. And in that memory lies the bridge to what came next. An era when the world tried to standardize, and the pistol, despite the arguments against it, refused to fade because people had learned how to make it better without breaking what made it good. The design crossed theatres once. Soon it would cross decades. When the shooting stops, the paperwork begins. The pistol that had earned its place in mud and ruin stepped into a new arena after the mid-century wars, one where arguments were waged with spreadsheets, treaties, and flight manifests. The question was no longer, does it work? But does it fit a world that wants to move men, ammunition, and doctrine across oceans with as few frictions as possible? In that world, the older sidearm faced an adversary that never jams: standardization. As alliances tightened and logistics planners tried to erase chaos from supply chains, a single service cartridge for partners working side by side looked like simple sanity. If ships and cargo planes could carry one crate of handgun ammunition to feed multiple forces, then every pallet, every manifest, every emergency resupply became easier. The conversation gained momentum, and with it came new service pistols designed from the start around higher capacity magazines and lighter frames that would not punish hips and lower backs on long days. On the technical side, the case for a smaller caliber paired with higher capacity looked persuasive. Metal science and bullet design had advanced. Test blocks and chronographs started to tell a nuanced story. Modern projectiles could reach performance envelopes that satisfied duty requirements without relying solely on mass and diameter. Meanwhile, the realities of patrol and convoy operations put a new premium on how many cartridges a sidearm could carry before a reload and how swiftly those reloads could be performed under stress. Where earlier doctrine imagined a sidearm as a personal last resort, later training folded it more deliberately into the continuum of force. In that continuum, time and repetition mattered. A magazine that kept giving without a change-out, a spare that seated without drama, and a system that favoured consistency in 1,000 hands. All of that pressed the scale. Procurement officers are not villains in this story, they are translators. Their job is to convert a nation's strategy into contracts that arrive on time. A sidearm for general issue has to satisfy more than shooters' preferences. It must be economical to manufacture by the 100,000. It must be simple to maintain at an armory staffed by young technicians rotating in and out. It must share ammunition with allies to tame the logistical snarl of combined operations. Against that checklist, new 9mm designs, often polymer-framed and striker-fired, checked boxes that the older steel frame could not without rewriting its nature. The math was blunt. Capacity, weight, cost, and coalition convenience piled onto one side of the ledger until even people who liked the old trigger felt the argument leaning away from them. Then there were the human factors that resisted tidy charts. The single-action trigger that had taught generations of soldiers to press rather than yank did not quietly surrender to utilitarian double-action pulls. Many shooters shot the older pistol better. The all-steel frame, heavier on the belt, soaked recoil in a way that made fast, accurate hits feel like a natural rhythm rather than a wrestling match. Instructors who had learned on the old gun watched qualification scores dip during transition periods, then gradually climb as new manuals and repetitions rebuilt confidence. The changeover was not a ceremony. It was a grinding process of retraining. Holsters changed, safety scripts changed, and muscle memory had to be overwritten with deliberate practice. The institution paid that price because the reward was a cleaner supply chain and a common language with allies. The politics of replacement played out in headlines and in quiet memos. A single contract for a new service pistol could ripple from factory towns to allied capitals. There were reliability trials, salt fog chambers, dust tests, and ice baths, each of which taught the same lesson in different languages. Modern designs were mature enough to shoulder the burden of general issue. At the same time, the older pistol refused to be reduced to a sentimental artifact. It stayed on for a while in reserve units and special billets, appearing at ranges with new springs and better magazines, as if to say that even bureaucracy can't unlearn a good trigger overnight. Public perception could be brutal or forgiving, depending on the decade. Some observers declared that the switch to 9mm was an admission that the old cartridge had been overpraised. Others called the move a capitulation to fashion. Both positions miss the institutional truth. A military that expects to fight alongside partners will try to make common cause at the loading table, not only on the battlefield map. A pistol that drinks the same ammunition as the unit next door simplifies airlift, storage, and emergency resupply. The virtue is dull but powerful: predictability. When you can predict what a forward operating base needs, you can stack boxes before they are asked for. Predictability saves lives in ways that glory never will. Inside the organizations, the change felt less like a revolution than like replumbing a city. Holsters changed, safety scripts changed, qualification drills rewired hand memory. Logistics officers redrew spreadsheets and smiled when commonality reduced error bars. And yet, in the rooms set aside for strange and specific missions, another story continued. Units built around precision, hostage rescue, or protective details kept a soft spot for the crisp break, the straight-back recoil impulse, and the frame that points like a handshake. They had the training budgets and armourer attention to make the old platform sing, and when mission justifications were written in tight language about shot placement at speed, the old case could still be made and still be won. That dual reality, mass issue moving one way while small communities chose another, often confuses people who want a single verdict. There isn't one. The General Force received a pistol that answered the needs of coalition warfare and budget discipline. Specialist teams kept a pistol that answered the needs of narrow margins and long training cycles. Neither side betrayed the other. Each obeyed its math. The institution's great compromise was to let both truths live at once, seeing the sidearm not as an identity, but as a tool with multiple correct answers. The older pistol's dignity in this era comes from how it accepted being demoted without becoming diminished. It did not sulk in museums. It entered competitions, guarded doorways, and continued to educate hands. It found life in the private market where citizens, police-tacked units, and competitors could spend the time and money that a large bureaucracy cannot lavish on every individual weapon. There, the platform showed a virtue that procurement officers cannot measure easily. It makes people better at shooting because it never lies about the sights. Ask an armourer who lived through the transition what the draw looks like today, and you will see the compromise laid out in steel and polymer. On one side sits the modern service pistol, light, capacious, easy to teach to large numbers, and proven across climates. On the other sights the old frame with new sights and fresh springs, its finish honest from handling, its trigger still breaking like the end of a clear sentence. The draw is not a museum case. It is a working summary of how institutions choose when money, alliances, and human hands share the same table. In that sense, replacement was not a funeral. It was a reorganization. A new pistol answered the broad question of alliance logistics. An old pistol answered the narrow questions that depend on feel, feedback, and the moral comfort of a tool that never lies about what the sights are doing. The story moves forward with both answers in play. The uniforms change, the holsters change, the manuals change, but the reasons remain. That is how something born in 1911 outlives the very words used to retire it, for now. General issue moved on, but the platform refused to pack its bags. It slipped into the rooms where mission drives selection and where the people who carry tools also write the standards for them. In those rooms, a sidearm is not a generic symbol. It is a primary instrument for a narrow slice of tasks measured in inches and seconds. The qualities that once endeared the pistol to muddy fields, honest trigger, predictable cycle, parts that tell the truth, turned out to be equally valuable behind a breaching charge or inside a hallway with too many doors. The logic is simple. When decisions are cruelly close, feedback matters. A trigger that breaks like an honest word lets a shooter separate aiming from firing. A slide that tracks straight back lets the front sight return without negotiation. A frame with enough weight to calm recoil makes double taps line up like a practiced signature. Modernized variants grew out of that need rather than nostalgia. A rail under the dust cover accepted white lights because work increasingly happened at night or in dark interiors. Stronger springs and improved small parts took advantage of better metallurgy. Slides wore durable finishes that shrugged at sweat and salt. Ambidextrous safeties acknowledged that teams could not afford to be single-handed in their doctrine. Magazines improved with stronger bodies and followers that did not choke. Accuracy enhancements ceased to be indulgence and became normal. Barrels fit so lockup was repeatable, bushings lapped until the muzzle returned to the same place every time. The aesthetic remained familiar. The intent was brutally present tense. When people talk about custom in this context, they do not mean decoration. They mean fitting surfaces until locking lugs seat perfectly and barrels return to the same point like a metronome. They mean extractors tuned so empties leave in a tidy arc, not a spray of uncertainty. They mean triggers set to safe weights that nevertheless break without lies. A pistol built this way is not fragile. It is simply finished. The result is a machine that rewards dry fire, makes live fire honest, and resists the chaos that lives in tight rooms. Competition shooting provided a parallel laboratory. On a hot range filled with timers and opinions, the platform proved that an old outline can still race. Magwells flared to invite reloads, fibre optic sights pulled daylight into the eye, and compensators appeared in divisions that allowed them. The heavy frame kept the dot or front sight calm, while the clean break shortened the gap between intention and impact. Younger shooters who had never worn a uniform discovered that the pistol teaches with a firm but fair voice. If the sights wander, the target tells on you. If the trigger hand flinches, the paper tattles. The pistol's popularity in those arenas was not a rejection of modern service pistols. It was a celebration of what happens when feedback is immediate and mechanical. Law enforcement teams with focused missions, protective details, tactical units, agencies that spend disproportionate time on surgical problems, selected the platform not because it was fashionable, but because their training pipelines could support it. They shot enough to make the manual of arms second nature. They maintained springs and magazines on schedules. They authored policies that matched the tool. In that environment, the pistol did not feel like a compromise. It felt like a choice. When those teams wrote their after-action notes, they tended to mention the same benefits: shot placement at speed, confidence under stress, and the way a good trigger makes accountability easier because misses cannot be blamed on slop. There are, of course, boundaries. Issuing thousands of hand-fitted steel pistols to a force that turns over quickly is not sensible in most budgets. Polymer service pistols with generous capacity and minimal maintenance win that fight by design. The platform survives precisely because it does not try to win every fight. It lives where precision, feedback, and user confidence are weighted heavily, where armourers can touch each gun, where doctrine prefers a clean break to a long pull. The fact that such places exist says less about romance and more about the diversity of missions in a complicated world. Spend time with a unit that runs them and the romance falls away. You will see gauges for sear and hammer hooks, extractor tools, and bins of springs marked by round counts. You will hear slide rails that sound like sealed zippers, a sign of proper lubrication and fit. Shooters will talk not about legends, but about how the front sight returns and how the trigger lets them call a shot. When a part trends toward failure, it is swapped, the lesson is written down, and the standard quietly improves. This is craft without the costume. At the same time, the private market bloomed. Citizens who care about craft and control bought examples that fit their hands and their patience. Some chose classic calibers, others explored modern loads that play nicer with steel frames. Custom houses flourished, turning fitting into an art that has nothing to do with engraving and everything to do with function. The irony is gentle but real. Mass replacement in one world created a renaissance in another. Freed from being the universal answer, the pistol became a specialized instrument and found itself valued more clearly. Look closely and the present tense is obvious. Slides carry modern optics on plates or dovetails. Holsters are cut for weapon lights. Safeties are reshaped to ride well under thumbs trained high. Magazines wear base pads sized for gloved hands. The silhouette remains, but the details confess the century. It is the same song in a new room, played by people who care less about what the gun meant once and more about what it does now. It points, it breaks clean, it hits where the front sight promises, and it leaves brass in a neat little constellation on the ground. For the small communities that kept it, the sidearm also shaped training language. New shooters were taught to treat the safety as a rhythm rather than as a switch, on when the muzzle is not on target, off when it is, back on at reset. The simplicity of that rhythm, tied to a short, consistent trigger, reduced the cognitive load during complex entries and awkward searches. In force-on-force scenarios, after masks came off and heartbeats slowed, debriefs returned to the same observations. The platform made good choices easier to perform and bad choices harder to excuse. Another reason for persistence lives in accountability. Specialists who fire large round counts every year are the first to see whether a system lies. If a trigger weight drifts, they feel it. If reliability sours after a predictable interval, they track it and change springs before the trend becomes failure. The pistol's very age becomes an advantage here, because it has been studied long enough for maintenance to be doctrine instead of folklore. Schedules exist, numbers are known. The gun responds to care the way a known machine should, with no surprises except the pleasant kind. None of this makes the platform a talisman or a universal prescription. It is instead a reminder that tools earn their futures one hard use at a time. The reason an object born before anyone carried a smartphone still turns locks in certain armories is not sentiment, but results measured in decisiveness. In the rooms where doors get rammed at 3 a.m, in the cars where protectees sit while routes get cleared, the weapon on a hip is a promise. This one keeps the promise in a way that the people who depend on promises understand. Lay the pistol on a table and you can explain its heart with a pencil. Draw a line along the slide to show where steel rides steel. Circle the barrel at the muzzle, then tap the link under the chamber to show where motion begins. Press the slide back and watch the dance. Barrel and slide travel together for a breath. The link pulls the barrel down out of lock, and the slide continues alone to the rear, extracting and ejecting the spent case. A spring, compressed like a held note, then drives the slide forward again, stripping the next round from the magazine, nudging it up the feed ramp and pushing it into the chamber as the barrel cams up to lock. It is choreography more than magic, and it is designed to be repeatable even when the stage is dirty. The phrase short recoil operation sometimes scares people who imagine complexity, but the choreography is as old as the design and as clear as a metronome once you slow it down. Think of it as timing and alignment. Timing ensures that the barrel is still locked when pressure is high. Alignment ensures that the next round meets the chamber lip at the correct angle. Everything else, the shape of the feed ramp, the stiffness of the spring, the extractor's tension, is in service of those two ideas. If you have ever watched a door that closes smoothly because the hinges and latch were hung correctly, you understand the sensation of a well-fit slide and barrel returning to battery. There is no drama, just conclusion. The single-action trigger is the other pillar. It moves in a straight line with minimal stacking, and when it breaks like a declaration. That crispness is not snobbery, it is feedback. Under stress, humans crush triggers. A mushy break turns crushing into steering. A clean break lets the shooter separate the act of aiming from the act of firing, which is why a platform like this becomes a teacher. The gun tells you the truth about whether the sights were where you thought they were. Many shooters discover, to their mild embarrassment, that they were not. That lesson, repeated calmly, is how accuracy becomes habit rather than hope. What about safety? The design stacks layers in a way that feels like a handshake rather than a hurdle. The manual safety blocks the sear, so the trigger cannot release the hammer when engaged. The grip safety interrupts the trigger bow unless the hand is properly seated, which means the pistol is both ready for action and resistant to negligent presses when it is not being held as a pistol should. Some worry that two safeties are two chances to forget something. In practice, users develop a ritual: safety on when the muzzle is off target, safety off as the sights settle, safety on as the gun returns to the ready. Rituals that match human rhythm are not burdens. They are bridges. Ergonomics hide in plain sight. The grip angle places the front sight under the eye in a way that rewards a high, firm hold. The beaver tail, small on early examples, more generous on later ones, allows the hand to climb without being punished. The bore axis sits higher than on some modern pistols and lower than on others, but the weight of the all-steel frame drives recoil straight back instead of letting it tumble upward. The sights, once humble, now often glow or use high-contrast faces, and the slide cuts that were once purely practical have become rails for optics on variants meant to carry dots. None of this breaks the old silhouette. It simply admits that eyes, hands, and light change with time. Maintenance is not romance, it is a schedule. The platform thrives when springs are replaced on time, magazines are treated as consumables rather than heirlooms, and extractors are tensioned to spec. People who complain that the design is finicky often run neglected springs and bad magazines, then blame the frame. People who treat the pistol as a machine with habits tend to enjoy boredom. It runs, it runs, it runs, and when something changes, the slide slows, the ejection starts to dribble, it is a sign that a wear item wants attention. Predictable failure is not failure, it is communication. Modularity, in the modern sense, is not its native language, yet the design speaks enough of it to stay relevant. Slides swap on frames with proper fitting. Barrels can be tuned for accuracy or reliability depending on mission. Triggers can be adjusted to a safe, consistent weight. Sights are replaceable with a dozen patterns. Rails can be integrated. The core remains steel, but materials around the edges have learned new tricks. Coatings that resist salt, grips that shrug at sweat, small parts cut by wire EDM that hold dimensions like they mean it. Accuracy is the quiet dividend of this whole arrangement. A locked barrel that returns to the same place, a trigger that breaks like an honest word, and sights you can see produce groups that are not only small but centered. For a shooter whose job is to protect, that centering matters more than any romantic notion. It means hits where they must be in the time that is available. Recoil, often dramatized beyond its due, becomes a timing exercise rather than a battle. The slide's travel is the metronome. Learn to play to it, and the music will sound the same every time. Finally, there is the way the gun communicates. Machines have voices. This one speaks through vibration and resistance. When well lubricated, it feels silky without being loose. When dirty, it grows a little grainy but still decisive. If a magazine lip bends, the first sign is often a hesitation you feel before you see. If the extractor loses tension, empties start to eject to odd places. These whispers are not mysticism. They are the language of a device that was built stoutly enough to survive and sensitive enough to warn. For newcomers, the proof arrives on paper. Start at 7 yards and press 5 clean shots with a front sight focus. The cluster tells the truth about what the platform teaches in an hour. Move to 10 and 15. Add a draw from a holster and the rhythm of safety off, front sight, press, reset becomes almost metrical. As speed climbs, the benefit of a short, consistent trigger and a slide that tracks flat becomes obvious. The machine is not making anyone better than they are. It is simply refusing to add problems that skill is supposed to solve. That refusal is why it still makes sense in places where excuses are unwelcome. In the end, explaining why the design still works does not require poetry. It requires honesty about how humans learn under stress and how steel behaves under pressure. The pistol respects both. It gives the mind a simple checklist to run and the hand a simple set of motions to repeat. It forgives small errors without indulging bad habits. It rewards attention without demanding worship. That is why it stays in service here and there, and why people who depend on sidearms still nod when they see its outline. Not every artifact that survives earns a second life. Some merely persist. This pistol did both. After the uniforms changed and procurement moved on, the silhouette stayed on posters, in glass cases, on match tables, and in stories told with the kind of energy that only comes from experience. Part of this is recognition. The outline is graphic design gold, flat sides, a squared slide, a trigger guard that frames purpose, and a dust cover that makes the whole machine look planted. Artists love it because it reads at a glance. Shooters love it because it feels like something that will still be working when the lights come back on. Historians love it because each example is an object lesson in industrial capacity, doctrine, and the way human hands wear steel smooth. Collectors came first, not in chronology, but in passion. They learned to read stamps the way archivists read marginalia. A roll mark from a wartime contractor tells of an assembly line that learned a new craft under pressure. A faint ordnance wheel on a frame connects one serial number to a supply officer's careful paperwork and a quartermaster's day that probably involved more grease than romance. Patina, a word that sometimes excuses neglect, here becomes a record of service, edges worn smooth by holster leather, slide flats thinned by hands that checked readiness without ceremony. To the uninitiated, it looks like wear. To people who know, it reads like evidence. These are not relics of boasting. They are files in an archive you can hold. Competition found a different kind of beauty. At speed, the crisp single-action trigger turns discipline into time saved. Shooters step to the line knowing that if their sights are honest, the shot will be honest. Gunsmiths turned that promise into machines that do not so much recoil as reset. Fibre optics drag sunlight into the eye. Extended safeties give the thumb a wide shelf, reinforcing a high grip that controls the pistol like a crew controls a craft. Magwells flare like funnels, making reloads a matter of angles rather than hopes. The point is not that the platform wins every match. It is that it remains competitive in the hands of people who understand what it demands and what it gives back. Then there is the world's most democratic museum, film and television. Directors use the pistol as shorthand. It signals a certain era when paired with olive drab and a steel helmet. It signals a certain competence when it rides on the hip of a character who knows what they are doing. The camera loves moving parts, and this machine gives it motion worth watching. The slide stroking back, the hammer falling with decisive intent, the ejected case spinning into light. Sound teams love it because the report and mechanical noise have a timbre audiences recognize even if they cannot name it. The result is an object that lives in the public imagination as both artifact and actor. Civilians who do not live in prop rooms or on match stages still find reasons to keep the old design close. Some do so for the way it points. Others do so for the way it talks to them in maintenance, rewarding attention with monotony. Many discover that the expense of a well-made example buys something other platforms do not always offer, a lifetime relationship where parts and springs can be renewed in cycles, where the frame and slide are more like a house that you keep repairing and less like a disposable appliance. The language may be sentimental, the practice is not. It is simply ownership that feels like stewardship. Cultural afterlife also means argument. The pistol lives inside debates about caliber, capacity, and what matters most when bad minutes arrive. In those discussions, it often stands as an anchor point, a known quantity against which new ideas are compared. That role is valuable even when a person ultimately chooses something else. A standard gives the mind a reference, and this platform has become one. It is hard to understand a modern service pistol without understanding why this older one does what it does so convincingly. There is a quiet economy around all this. Small shops machine sights and hammers. Holster makers stitch leather and press modern thermoplastics to fit the slide's proud lines. Magazine makers, the unsung heroes of reliability, compete to provide springs and bodies that feed like promise. Ammunition companies load everything from soft-shooting target rounds to defensive offerings that let the cartridge show its best manners. The result is an ecosystem that would look like nostalgia if it were not clearly a living market full of feedback loops and incremental improvements. The cultural thread runs through families too. A grandfather hands one down, and a grandchild meets a piece of steel that compresses history into something you can hold. The younger hands clean it, run it, and discover that the weight is not a chore but a stabilizer, that the trigger is not a dare but a servant, that the sight picture is not archaic but informative. Objects that teach are rare. Objects that teach and persuade across generations are rarer. In that sense, the pistol stopped being a weapon long enough to become a teacher, and then, in capable hands, became both again. Yet even as it lives in memory and media, it refuses to relax into a relic. New manufacturers still bet their reputation on building good examples. Custom houses still polish rails, lap lugs, and test fire until groups stack. Competition shooters still choose it in divisions that allow it, not because it is required, but because it remains competitive. Defensive shooters still pick it when they value a certain kind of control above a certain kind of capacity. These are choices made in the full light of alternatives, which is the strongest kind of vote an object can receive. If you want a single image to carry this afterlife into the present, picture a match morning. The sun hasn't burned the dew off the barrels yet. Shooters set steel. Someone tapes targets. A bell rings for a stage brief. On a bench under a canopy, a pistol lies with its slide locked back, a magazine seated beside it. An older man checks his gear and nods at a teenager who is learning the rules. The teenager picks up the pistol with a coach's permission, feels the weight, thumbs the safety down under supervision, lifts the front sight into the notch, and smiles because alignment suddenly makes sense. When the timer finally beeps, the lesson is visible even to bystanders. The gun tracks flat, the front sight returns, the cadence becomes a kind of music. There are misses, there are smiles, there is the low murmur of people who understand that tools and craft grow together. After the last string, the teenager locks the slide, sets the pistol down, and the older man grins because something permanent just happened. A piece of history proved itself in the only court that matters, the immediate present. That is the cultural afterlife, an object that keeps earning its place, not because it used to be good, but because right now, in capable hands, it still is. The sidearm that walked off the battlefield did not immediately hang itself on a wall. It went to work in uniforms whose wars were measured in doorways, traffic stops, courthouse corridors, and nights in unmarked sedans. Small teams valued predictable accountability. A single-action trigger gave trained hands a measurable press. Hits became a duty because the machine translated intention without blur. Instructors could point to a sight picture, to a break they could feel and hear, and to impacts that matched the lesson. When people's lives ride on split-second decisions, that kind of mechanical honesty is a currency everyone accepts. Protective details adopted the pistol for a more specific reason. In crowds where innocence breathe the same air as threats, confidence in the break and in the front sight matters more than capacity on a spec sheet. A rhythm emerges, safety on, safety off as the sight settles, press, safety on again. Drilled into bones, that rhythm calms complex scenes. Teams that train daily afford that ritual. In their world, a platform that rewards attention is not a hobby horse. It is a shield that works best when a mind is busy with a dozen other tasks, from radio traffic to body placement to the direction of a panicked tide of people. Courtrooms reinforced the calculus. Reviews asked for cause and effect, not folklore. With this mechanism, the timeline is audible and visible. The safety moves. The sight picture becomes explicit on camera. The break is crisp enough to timestamp testimony. Investigators who were not there can follow the sequence because the tool creates clean markers. Where citizens demand accountability, clear mechanics reduce fog. The pistol's transparency became policy's ally. This is not to claim the design owned the badge. Many agencies standardized on lighter, higher-capacity pistols that make sense for large, rotating forces. Yet inside those organizations, pockets remained where the old frame stayed on the equipment list. High-tempo task forces wrote exemptions because performance defended the choice. Qualification lines told the story. Strings that demanded precision under time pressure produced scores that justified the paperwork. And when new hires graduated into those units, the training pipeline took over and made the ritual second nature. Private security evolved in parallel. Corporate teams charged with guarding human beings rather than building selected tools that made accountability concrete. The movie guard in a warehouse is fiction. The real work happens in suits, on sidewalks, and on airfields. There, a weapon is not an identity, it is a promise to control outcomes under pressure. The platform's balance kept muzzles on narrow lanes. The heavy slide soaked imperfect grip angles when adrenaline pushed hands toward bad habits. When the same people also trained with carbines and radios and medical kits, a sidearm that behaved like a known sentence, subject, verb, object, was a relief. Another truth explained it. Maintenance could be disciplined instead of improvisational. Schedules for spring changes and inspection intervals carried over from military doctrine into agency binders. Armourers with stones and gauges kept fleets behaving the same on Tuesday and Friday. Predictability across dozens of individual pistols meant teams could treat weapons as interchangeable without discovering surprises mid-operation. In the language of risk management, reducing surprise is the adult version of luck. Stories filtered back from watch commanders and district attorneys under heavy scrutiny. The ease of calling shots, knowing precisely when a break occurred and what the sights showed at that moment, made testimony cleaner. Body cameras added a new layer to that honesty, and the platform's mechanical clarity matched the new era of visual evidence. Reviewers scrubbed frame by frame, saw the sight, heard the break, and mapped the decision. In contested cases, that clarity became the difference between argument and proof. None of this is nostalgia. It is pragmatism with a steel accent. Where budgets or training time ran thin, simpler manuals and larger capacities made sense, and those choices were wise. But in the corners where precision remained the coin of the realm, the old frame continued to earn paychecks. Badges do not reward sentiment, they reward intact bystanders and clean reports. Civilian life mirrored these lessons. Competitors and citizens discovered the same attributes stabilized minds under stress. Responsibility is heavy. A tool that keeps its promises lightens it. The sight returns. The trigger tells the truth. The day ends with a quiet click as a safety goes on and a holster snaps shut. In that click is the sound of a century-old design doing a modern job without drama, which is the most reliable kind of praise. The calendar turned and doctrine changed, but the outline still appears in places where missions privilege certainty over fashion. Modern conflicts scatter units across deserts, cities, mountains, and coasts, still. The sidearm is not a primary answer there, yet it remains a serious one when rooms get too crowded for long guns, or when a malfunction steals seconds nobody can spare. In that squeeze, some teams bring forward a machine whose behavior they know down to the timing of its reset. Familiar rhythm is not romance, it is speed that does not lie. Modernized variants wear the century openly. Rails under dust covers hold white lights bright enough to turn caves into maps. Hard finishes shrug at sweat and salt water. Optic plates accept small red dots that float like lighthouses above steel sights. Ambidextrous controls acknowledge that hands get busy or injured and still need to run a safety from either side. Magazines, the lifeblood of any repeating pistol, now come with bodies and followers that resist dents and tilts that used to become malfunctions at the worst moment. The silhouette stays familiar, but the details confess the era. Logistics officers know the costs. Issuing an all-steel, single-action sidearm to a large force would ignore the economies that polymer-duty pistols achieve with capacity and simplicity. But small missions create their own mathematics. In high-tempo teams, round counts become calendars. Shooters burn cases under timers and masks. Their sidearm is a last chance that gets first-class attention. In that equation, a platform that rewards repetition with measurable progress survives on merit alone. Today's battlefields add surveillance and after-action analysis the original designers could not imagine. Every engagement may be reviewed in slow motion by people far from the sound of it. That scrutiny rewards traceable cause and effect. A clean break at a known point, a sight picture that can be described without excuse, a recoil path that repeats across strings, all of it reads clearly to investigators who were not there. When tools sketch a crisp line between intention and impact, accountability keeps its footing even when memory wobbles. The role remains narrow. It ends fights that began too close, rescues rifles that decided to hiccup at the worst time, and addresses corners where a long barrel would sign your presence too early. In vehicles where belts and radios tangle elbows, the steel pistol is not glamorous, it is available. In stairwells, it is a scalpel, not a sword. Medics who carry it as an afterthought still practice with it as if it were a plan, because in chaos, the afterthought becomes the only thought that matters. Another reason it persists is that it adapts without losing the rhythm that made it trusted. Dots on slides do not erase the front sight for those who prefer it. Lights do not demand new rituals, they sit where thumbs can find them. The safety remains a conversation between intent and action, not a puzzle. In drills, shooters note that despite optics, accessories and coatings, the instrument inside is the same instrument. The barrel locks, the slide runs true, the trigger breaks and resets like a metronome. Many services now point elsewhere for general issue, and that is rational. Standardized ammunition simplifies coalition warfare. Simpler manuals reduce training time for large cohorts. High capacity buys margin for ordinary officers facing extraordinary days. None of those truths falsify another. In carefully chosen compartments of modern conflict, the older frame still earns its seat. It shows up carried by people whose names will not be public, whose reports will be short, and whose measure of success is that the report is short because nothing went wrong. There is a final, quieter virtue at work. The platform's long life has made it a library of failure modes that are known, catalogued and preventable. Springs have schedules measured in rounds, not hopes. Extractors have tensions you can feel with a gauge instead of guessing. Magazines are consumables with predictable lifetimes. That mechanical literacy gives teams fewer surprises in the worst minutes. Surprise is the enemy of survival in close work. You want the world to spring the ambush, you do not want your sidearm to try it. A design that lives this long collects stories the way an old ship collects barnacles. Some are charming, some slow it down. Clearing them off does not require anger. Only patience and the same method the platform rewards on the range, one clean pass at a time. Begin with the accusation that it never proved itself in the trenches, that its reputation is nostalgia. The record says otherwise. Letters, depot notes and training reports from the era describe a pistol that kept running in bad places, and an ecosystem of parts and procedures that evolved to keep it that way. Anecdote supports it, but so do the dull documents that have no reason to flatter machines. Next is the claim that it was abandoned because it was dangerously difficult to manage. This confuses institutional logistics with individual performance. The general force migrated to different pistols for reasons of alliance ammunition, capacity, and simplified manuals for rotating personnel. At the same time, units that could afford high-tempo training kept the steel frame precisely because it made performance repeatable. Both realities are true. Pretending otherwise grants gossip the status of analysis. Capacity arguments arrive in every era. They are not wrong, they are simply incomplete when stated as slogans. More rounds in a magazine increase forgiveness during long fights and allow more projectiles to be launched between solutions. Yet fights are not won by arithmetic alone. They are won by time, placement, and restraint, as well as by volume. The platform's appeal in specific niches has always been that it lets trained hands place what matters quickly and stop when a threat is solved. That is not romance, it is economy of force. The internet also loves the idea that the design is archaic and therefore inaccurate by modern standards. Accuracy is not a birthright of polymers or a punishment of steel. It is the product of barrel lockup, sight clarity, trigger behavior, and shooter discipline. The frame and slide in question have, for generations, stacked holes when properly built and properly run. Competitive arenas, hardly shelters for weak equipment, are blunt about this. Timers do not flatter. Targets do not accept excuses. Performance is public. There is a recurring whisper that the pistol requires arcane maintenance rituals, and that only wizards with stones and files can keep it alive. The truth is more ordinary. Springs replaced on schedule, magazines treated as the consumables they are, and extractors tensioned correctly account for most of what keeps the machine boring. Boredom here is the outcome worth seeking. It means cycles that repeat. It means ejection that lands brass in the same neighborhood shot after shot. It means surprises become rare, which is another way of saying safety improves without slogans. Another favorite is the idea that the cartridge defines the platform beyond rescue. Caliber debates are the shooting world's weather, always present, rarely settled. Ammunition technology evolves. Bullets now behave in ways their grandparents could not. Within that evolution, a heavy, moderate-velocity round driven from a controllable platform continues to meet certain performance standards cleanly. People who select tools for narrow missions make their choices with that fact pattern in mind. Others choose different answers for different contexts. That pluralism is not a contradiction, it is the point of having options. Finally, there is the sly claim that affection for the design is nostalgia wearing range gear. Some affection surely is, and there is no harm in that. History should be loved, but affection does not pass qualification under a timer, and sentiment does not clear a room. The design still appears in places where affection is irrelevant and sentiment is a liability. The people who bring it there are not poets. They are pragmatists holding a tool that does what they ask in language they trust. Scraping away these barnacles does more than brighten reputation. It reveals the lines that let the machine move cleanly through water. The silhouette makes sense again. The mechanics read as logic rather than as scripture. A newcomer sees not a relic but an instrument with known behaviours, trade-offs and disciplines. The truth is less dramatic than rumour and more interesting than nostalgia, a tool that earned its keep, kept its promises, and in capable hands still does both. Endings, told honestly, are about noticing which doors never needed to close. This story began with a slab of steel on a bench and a sentence about a weapon that should have been outpaced by time, but somehow was not. Across mud, assembly lines, courtrooms and quiet ranges, the outline survived because it rewarded hard use and honest hands. The lesson is not that old is good by virtue of age, or that new is suspect by virtue of novelty. The lesson is that certain design choices, clear feedback, fair tolerances, human-scale controls, age well because they cooperate with how minds and muscles behave when stakes are high. It matters now because institutions and individuals still face moments that punish wishful thinking. You cannot spreadsheet your way through a doorway. You cannot standardize fear out of a fight. You cannot legislate precision into a trigger finger that has not practiced. What you can do is select tools that simplify choices and train until those choices unfold like habit. The sidearm here is an example. Its mechanics do not flatter sloppiness, and that is why it keeps showing up where excuses go to die. There is a civic component. Public trust is fragile. Weapons policy, training standards, and procurement decisions all leave marks on community confidence. A tool that produces repeatable results in trained hands helps keep those marks clean. It makes accountability easier because shots are not negotiated by vague mechanics, but issued by crisp decisions the machine translates faithfully. When reviews map choice to consequence without fog, institutions look like promises kept. On a more intimate scale, the pistol's long service teaches a craft ethic beyond metal. Good work accepts constraints instead of excuses. Feed the machine decent magazines. Replace springs on time. Clean it without fetish. Learn the rhythm until it is not a trick but a reflex. None of these steps are glamorous, yet together they turn equipment into an ally you can trust. This is true of instruments, kitchens, and code bases as surely as it is of pistols. The object becomes a teacher, and then, if you listen long enough, a partner. For those who will never wear a uniform or tape a target, the meaning is still practical. Objects that endure are classrooms. Hold one and read manufacturing by touch. Cycle the slide and you hear a sentence spoken in steel. Press the trigger and you understand at a gut level why language about control matters more than debates about decoration. Then you put it down, perhaps choosing something else. That is fine. The lesson follows you anyway. Pick things that tell you the truth. History will keep moving in rings. New materials will yield pistols that seem to erase friction itself. Optics will shrink, reticles will bloom, and training will shape habits more precisely than ever. In that future, the old frame is a reference. It reminds designers that ergonomics anchored in the hand, not in the catalogue, last longer. It reminds instructors that honest feedback beats clever drills. It reminds policymakers that commonality makes armies fast and clarity makes them accountable. Most of all, it reminds users of every stripe that tools and character meet in the same place, deliberate choices repeated until they become second nature. So we arrive at the quiet question behind this journey. A pistol born in 1911 still finds work in a century that measures problems by satellites and software. Is that an indictment of progress or a celebration of foundations? The fair answer is that progress built suburbs around a solid old house, then kept visiting because the porch lights still worked and the floorboards did not creak. The design did not survive by accident. It survived because it met people at the intersection of simple motions and serious intent. If you are holding the pistol now on a range with powder hanging low, there is a last exercise worth doing. Bring the front sight into the notch and pause. Ease the safety down. Press. The noise is present tense and echo at once. Brass arcs. The slide writes a fast line and returns to the same place. That unremarkable return is the remark. It is the signature of a device whose century of work distilled into one motion still makes sense when the world gets small and seconds matter.